everyone. Thanks for coming out today. So the representation of African Americans in post-war American film noirs has been minimally addressed in scholarly film studies. Through presenting historical information and stills from various post-war American film noirs, I hope to shed some light on this topic. My intent is to provide you with a socio-political background and introduce three types of classification of African American representation in post-war American film noirs, such as invisibility, marginalization, and glamorization. I hope that through examining African American representation in post-war American film noirs, that we can deepen our appreciation for film noirs and add an additional lens with which to view the films. So let's explore the socio-political climate of post-war America to provide a framework for this talk. Jim Crow laws, the title given to the enforced Southern caste system, legitimized racial segregation and made it difficult for African Americans to live in the South, especially with mounting efforts from the National Negro Council and the NAACP regarding labor and civil rights. This system of oppression led African Americans to leave the South in droves in a movement called the Great Migration. The Great Migration occurred between 1915 to 1970, where over 6 million African American Southerners left the South and moved to cities across the country to get away from the Jim Crow laws and have a chance at a better life. On this map, you can see how African Americans migrated across the country. In the 1940s alone, over 1.6 million African Americans left the South, which brings me to another facet of the Great Migration. As African Americans moved into cities across the nation, this means that previously white neighborhoods were now interracial. Urban areas became saturated with African Americans. White Americans had to compete with Black Americans for jobs, and there was a lack of labor force in the South. The real estate tactics such as blockbusting and steering, which was made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, encouraged African Americans to live in urban areas and European Americans to move to the suburbs. Ultimately, according to Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Warmth of Other Suns, she says that the Great Migration transformed urban America and recast the social and political order of every city it touched. The so-called communist threat of the 1950s intersected with racial tensions and resulted in increased discrimination for African Americans. To sum up the socio-political climate, the Jim Crow laws, the Great Migration, real estate tactics, communism, and urbanization fueled the growing racial tensions, and film noirs reflected these racial anxieties. So let's explore film noirs in order to provide an additional framework for this talk. When I talk about film noirs, I'm referring to American-made films from the 1940s and 1950s. French film critics Nino Frank and Jean-Pierre Chartier in the 1940s coined the phrase film noir, and it didn't become popularly used in America until decades later. Ultimately, film noirs reflect the pessimistic response to the socioeconomic conditions of post-war America. When white male protagonists engage in morally ambiguous activities in post-war film noirs, characters tend to assume a darker role. These darker roles are created through lighting, cinematography, and other film noir elements that are characteristic of this film discourse. Acquisition of these morally darker characteristics is associated with African American characters and reinforces racial stereotypes. For instance, French critics Raymond Bourdieu and Étienne Châtillon described film noir's use of black and darkness as metaphors for white characters' moral transgressions and falls from grace in the eyes of acceptable middle-class society. The African-American representation in post-war American film noirs can be categorized as invisibility, glamorization, and marginalization. The first classification is invisibility, which refers to no reference at all to African Americans. Examples of this can be seen in the Asphalt Jungle and Detour. Characteristically, jazz scenes are associated with African Americans, yet in Detour, you see no reference to African Americans at all in the jazz scene. This invisibility or lack of representation of African Americans is particularly striking given that these films were set in urban settings and coincide with the Great Migration. The second classification is glamorization, which refers to the positive stereotypes of African Americans. Jan Zwager, the author of Dames in the Driver's Seat, states that black culture seems, in some classic film noir sequences, to represent not a source of evil, but an ideal if stereotypical world of sophistication, of feelings reflected in music, and of community. In other words, the familiarity with black culture enhances the lead character's hipness. Glamorized representation can be seen in Kiss Me Deadly and Out of the Past. We'll view a clip from Out of the Past a little bit later. The final classification is marginalization, which refers to how African Americans are typically represented in film noirs. For instance, African American actors were confined to subservient roles and received minimal speaking parts. Interestingly, there was an African American middle class, yet these films only depicted working class African Americans. Also, the advances and gains of African Americans in political and economic arenas were completely ignored. The subservient roles fulfilled the function of reasserting a pre-war vision of racial hierarchy. Examples of this can be seen in The Big Clock, where there's one hotel attendant and the postman always rings twice. There's one reference to African Americans in the scene where Cora leaves to visit her sick mother. In Sudden Fear, we see a porter offering Lester a deck of cards. In The Killers, Sam is tied up on the floor to reinforce his subservient role. In Double Indemnity, we generally see African Americans when Neff needs an alibi. According to Eric Avila, this reinforces the connection between blackness and criminality. In Kiss Me Deadly, we see Eddie, the boxing manager, interacting with Mike. We also see the African-American bartender as well. The jazz singer represents both the glamorized and marginalized representations of African-Americans. She is an object of hipness, has few lines, and functions to make Mike seem hip. In this clip from Out of the Past, it shows some of the racial associations that we've discussed, such as jazz club scenes being associated with African Americans.
Not anymore. No. She got pushed around. I would have saved my elbow. She got sick the backside.
How come you're asking? I want to find her.
Like that?
No, myself. Where'd she go?
Maybe I'll tell her.
Maybe more harm would come to her. She ain't gone now? I don't know. She just made it. Maybe you better say that.
Oh, I can't do much. Wasn't a cold place, though. That girl's really good.
Sure about that?
You know what? And that's good.
So try
So now I've shared with you the socio-political climate of post-war America and the three representations of African Americans in post-war film noirs. To sum up, the Jim Crow laws, the Great Migration, communism, real estate tactics, urbanization, all contributed to racial tensions and the representation of African Americans in post-war American film noirs. In order to deal with existing and growing racial anxieties, the post-war film noirs essentially whitewashed the screen in efforts to reassert pre-war racial power dynamics and regress to a pre-war status quo. The invisible and marginal subcategories of African American representation in film noir merely serves as a vehicle to reinforce racial stereotypes. Hopefully this talk provided you with a better understanding of African American representation in post-war American film noirs, and next time you watch a film noir, you will have an additional lens with which to view the films. Thank you very much, and here's my works cited.